We are at the latter part, in fact the last day of June, here in London. This last week, on Tuesday of this last week, was a very troubling documentary on BBC Radio, Radio 4, concerning honor killing. 45-minute documentary concerning the real problems of honor killing here in Britain, but also worldwide. And they were mentioning that there have been some celebrated cases. There are too many to mention. Let me just mention two that stood out, I remember. One concerned three men that have just been arrested or just been found guilty in the last 2 weeks, who had killed a young 20-year-old named Banaz Mahmoud. Her body was then put in a suitcase, which was found in Birmingham. And her crime, the reason why she was killed is she had had an affair outside of her faith. Now, I remember back in 2002, probably a more celebrated case was that of Yunus, who was a 16-year-old Kurd who had been killed, stabbed repeatedly by her father. And the reason she was stabbed by her father, according to his own admission, was that she had become too westernized, that she was wearing Western clothes, and that she had a Christian boyfriend. And it's these killings that were brought up in this documentary that I would like to talk about today. Why are so many young girls being killed? And why are so many of them coming out of a Muslim background? According to the United Nations Population Fund, they suggest that there are 5,000 of these killings that they know of that happen every year. Of those 5,000, the country with the largest number is Pakistan. Pakistan itself has over 1,000 killings, honor killings of women every year. And of course, it is those people that are having many of the ones that we're finding here in Britain. In Britain, about 12 women, girls, are killed every year from honor killings. 12 women who live here, who are British citizens, and therefore are protected by the state. But the interesting thing is, the excuses that are given for these honor killings by many Muslims who are questioned about it are numerous. They say that they refused to marry, and so therefore they were killed for that reason. In some cases, they divorced those who they had been forced to marry to begin with. Sometimes they had committed adultery, and that's why they were killed. The case of Yunus, the Kurdish girl, she became too westernized. She was wearing Western clothing and was dating a Christian, and so that was why she was killed. Probably the most troubling reason is that they had been raped, or they had been sexually molested, and because of being raped and been sexually molested, they brought dishonor upon the family, and that's why they're killed, because of that dishonor to the name of the family. Now, obviously, when you heard when you listened to the recording there on Radio 4, it was interesting to hear the excuses of the Muslims that were brought on. People like Inayat Bangalwala, who represented the Muslim Council of Britain, who back in 2003 said many Muslims are uncomfortable about how Islam has been dragged into this whole equation, because he said Islam categorically does not allow people to kill their own daughter. In the documentary on Tuesday, Rifat Drabu, who is also a member of the Council of Britain, a very eloquent lady, said that honor violence was a cultural practice and therefore was not a matter of faith, that it had nothing to do with Islam, that this was something that was primarily out of a cultural environment, and therefore we need to see it as such and stop blaming Islam for this. Now you can understand why they would say that, and you can understand why they were coming up and trying to push it over onto a cultural practice, because no religion wants to be labeled with honor killings. Certainly you might say that there have been killings, and there is even an injunction for killing in the Bible, in the Old Testament. We read in the book of Leviticus, in chapter 20, verses 10 to 16, a whole list of sins according to the Old Testament for which people could be killed. Adultery was one of them. Having sex with a man with another man, or a woman with another woman would have been a executable offense, capital offense, and having sex with an animal are all listed there. Now these aren't exactly honor killings. These are basically capital offense that were executable by death. I'm a Christian and I don't follow the Levitical law. Thank God I don't have to. That law was instigated in 1400 BC. We leave it in that time period. It's a Mosaic law. It no longer is a law that we follow. What we follow as Christians is the New Testament, and who we follow is Jesus Christ. And nowhere in the New Testament, nowhere is there any injunction about us killing anybody. No matter what the crime is, we are not permitted to kill. Thank God that we have the New Covenant, the New Testament, and that is one reason why rarely do you see any honor killings in Christian environment. Seem to suggest, obviously, that Christians are following their scriptures, are following their paradigm. But certainly, Inia Bangawala and Rifat Dorabu are bringing up a good point, and that is this not just a cultural manifestation, and should we be blaming in Islam, regardless of the fact that so many come out of Islamic environment? Is it because of their scriptures? Now, to answer that, we need to go back to the scriptures. We need to go back to the Qur'an. I've got a Qur'an here, and I want to go and open up to Surah 18. That's book 18, reading primarily from verse 65 to 81. If you have the time, read it on your own. We don't have time to go through all those verses. Basically, it's a scenario of Musa, who is the prophet Moses, talking to this mysterious character named Khidr. Khidr, we don't know who Khidr is. He sounds almost like a Melchizedek type of character. But he comes to show Musa how he is to live, and he follows him. Musa follows him, and while he is walking with him, he suddenly scuttles a boat, and doesn't say why he scuttles that boat. And then in verse 74 is the troubling verse, which says, then they both proceeded, that's both Musa, Moses, and Khidr, till they met a boy, and he, Khidr, killed him. Musa, or Moses, said, have you killed an innocent person who had killed none? Verily, you are committing a thing. Nukur. Nukur means basically a prohibited, an evil, a dreadful thing. So Musa questions him, why have you killed this little boy? Now, Khidr doesn't answer right away. It's not till later on in verse 80 that he finally gives the answer. And this is, I'll quote what the Quran says. And as for the boy, his parents were believers, and we feared lest he should oppress them by rebellion and disbelief. So we intended that the Lord should change him for them for one better in righteousness and near to mercy, verse 81. Stop and look and see what these two verses are saying, 74 and 80 especially. Verse 74 and 80 are suggesting that Khidr killed this boy because he was going to be a rebellious boy. Therefore, it was legitimate to kill him. Why? Well, to understand why, we need to go back to the tafsir. We need to go back to the exegetes. We need to go back to those Muslim scholars who have tried to help us understand these verses. And so I go back to men like Al-Jalalain, who is a well-known exegete, who said, as for the boy, referring to verse 80 and also verse 74, his parents were believers, and we feared lest he should overwhelm them with insolence and disbelief. For he is, as described by the hadith of Muslim, he was incorrigibly disposed to disbelief. And had he lived, this disposition of his would have oppressed them, that means the parents, because of their love for him. They would have followed him in such a path or such a disbelief. Therefore, it was legitimate for Khidr to kill him. Ibn Kathir, another great exegete, agrees with Al-Jalalain, and so do many others. I don't have time to read all of them. And then he goes on and says, after he says why is it he had to be killed, that if he had stayed alive, if this boy had stayed alive, he would have been the cause of their doom. So let a man be content with the decree of Allah. He goes on to say, so we intended that their Lord should exchange him for one better in righteousness and nearer to mercy, a child who is better than this one, a child for whom they would feel more compassion. Fascinating. Even the exegetes agree with Al-Khidr and explain what Al-Khidr is doing. This boy possibly would have been rebellious, therefore he must be killed. Here's the scriptural evidence. Here's the scriptural backing. And you say, well, why is that important? Well, Muslims have to follow their scripture, as we've said over and over again in so many of these videos. As we Christians have to follow the New Testament, so Muslims have to follow the Quran. And here is a valid case where scripture is allowing a boy to be killed because he may be rebellious, and he may possibly bring his parents not only into disrepute, but into disbelief. Now, obviously, as a Christian, it concerns me greatly because that suggests then that the Quran does have authority, does give authority for honor killing. This is going to disturb some of you Muslims who are listening to this. I know I'm going to get an awful lot of reaction. I don't think anybody's ever brought this verse public like this, and I don't think anybody's ever suggested before exactly what this verse is saying. The Quran is very powerful. It is your authority. You've got to deal with these verses. You've got to deal with your exegetes. Even your exegetes admit that this boy should have been killed. Can you then understand then why so many families today are doing just that? It's because of your Quran. I know that's going to open up a huge debate. Let's continue it, and let's see where we go from there. This is Jay then, over and out.